Hi everyone. This is the third and last part of my three-part sequence on international economics. In the first two recordings, we introduced the trade balance and exchange rates. This video covers international trade. The first two videos were based on Chapter 15 in the Farnham textbook. This material is actually based on a chapter from a rival textbook, which you can find posted on the Moodle page. I decided to include this supplemental material in our discussion on international economics because free trade and the impediments to free trade, like tariffs and quotas, are important concepts to understand and critically analyze given the context of the current business environment. As I mentioned in part one of this three-part sequence, a country can be classified as either an open economy or a closed economy. A special word for a closed economy is autarky, which is formally defined here. We will use this example of a country that doesn't trade as a baseline to understand the economic impact of free trade. We'll wrap up this semester by then taking a look at what happens to the economy when there's a tariff or quota that restricts free trade. So the punchline of this video is that consumers benefit from free trade, but domestic companies can suffer from free trade agreements. However, the economy is better off overall with free trade. So let's first talk about how economists determine whether consumers, producers, and the overall economy wins or loses from this type of policy. In general, consumer surplus is an economic measure of how happy consumers are. One thing that we will say is that the higher the consumer surplus, the happier consumers are. So how can we use consumer surplus to say that free trade makes consumers better off? Whenever consumers consider buying something, economists assume that people have a maximum willingness to pay for that item. So let's suppose we are willing and able to spend up to $200 for a new winter jacket. We have that number in mind when we go to the mall or check out a website. If the price of the jacket is less than or equal to that willingness to pay, then we buy it. If the price is higher than our willingness to pay, then we don't buy it. So if the price of a jacket is $150, then we buy the jacket. But we don't buy the jacket if the price is $220. Well, let's suppose the actual price is $150. Our consumer surplus is calculated as the difference between our willingness to pay and how much we actually paid. In my hypothetical example, our consumer surplus from buying a jacket is $50, since $200 minus $150 is $50. Now, we're not the only one who might be buying the jacket, so the consumer surplus in the market is the sum of each individual's consumer surplus. For simplicity, let's suppose that there are only 3 consumers total in the market: me, you, and your best friend. If my consumer surplus from buying a jacket is $55, and your consumer surplus is $50, and your best friend's consumer surplus is $40, then the total consumer surplus in the market is $55 plus $50 plus $40, which is $145. How do we illustrate consumer surplus on a graph? Well, recall from the supply and demand chapter that one way of thinking about the demand curve is that it's illustrating the consumer's willingness to pay at various quantities. And so if consumer surplus is the difference between how much consumers are willing to pay and how much they actually pay, then we can illustrate consumer surplus as the area below the demand curve and above the market price, which is reflected as a blue triangle in this graph. If consumer surplus is measuring how happy consumers are, then you can think of producer surplus as a measure of how happy producers are. In this case, we would say that companies only sell product if the price is greater than their marginal cost. So producer surplus is calculated as price minus marginal cost. So if the winter jacket costs North Face $75 to make and they can sell it for $200, then the producer surplus for North Face is $125. Which is $200 minus $75. So in a way, you can think of producer surplus as a proxy for profits. A higher profit level means firms are happier, and therefore, higher producer surplus means that firms are happier. If consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the market price, then producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the market price. Remember from the perfect competition chapter that we proved that the marginal cost curve is the company supply curve as long as we omit any parts of the marginal cost curve in which the company would shut down. So you can think of the gap between the price and marginal cost across all quantities sold as a red triangle illustrated in this graph. If we think of the economy as consisting of consumers and sellers, An economic surplus is then defined as consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So economic surplus is the blue triangle plus the red triangle, or the area between the demand curve and the supply curve. So what this suggests here is that there's no government intervention in the economy. We'll see how we could handle something like a government surplus and how that affects our measure of economic surplus when we analyze a tariff later in this video. Now that we have an understanding of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and economic surplus, let's apply the supply and demand model using gas or ethanol as our product in order to motivate the economic impact of tariffs and quotas. To start, let's assume that the US is a closed economy without any foreign trading partners. Let's also assume that the government doesn't intervene in the economy. In this case, we'll say that the equilibrium price for ethanol is $2 per gallon and the equilibrium quantity is 6 billion gallons per year. We can see how we can illustrate this scenario on a graph using our basic supply and demand curves. Again, the equilibrium price is $2 and the equilibrium quantity is 6 billion gallons. The consumer surplus is the blue triangle that shades in the area between the demand curve and the market price of $2, whereas the producer surplus is the red triangle that shades in the area between the supply curve and the market price of $2. Finally, economic surplus is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus, so economic surplus is the combination of both the blue and red triangles. We'll use this as our baseline model and see what would happen if we opened up our borders and allowed for free trade with the rest of the world. If the US just buys American ethanol, we said in the previous graph that the price would be $2 per gallon. Let's suppose we could get ethanol from Brazil and other countries for an even lower price, say $1 per gallon. How does this cheaper foreign ethanol affect the supply and demand for American ethanol? Well, what would happen is with free trade, the market price would decrease from $2 down to $1. Remember from our supply and demand chapter that when the price is set below the equilibrium price, the economy results in a shortage because quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. So what we'll see is that domestic producers of ethanol are going to respond to the lower price by reducing their production. The difference here is that the shortage can now be fulfilled by foreign producers in Brazil and elsewhere in the world. Ultimately, all we would be doing is importing the amount of the shortage into the US. This is the graph that illustrates the free trade scenario with the world price of ethanol at $1, whereas the equilibrium price with no trade and no government intervention being $2. Remember that the equilibrium quantity with no trade and no government intervention was 6 billion gallons, but now domestic producers will respond to the lower price by making less ethanol. So now, quantity supplied by American companies is only 3 billion. However, the law of demand states that lower prices will result in higher quantity demanded, so we can see that a decrease in the price of ethanol from $2 to $1 increases quantity demanded from 6 billion to 9 billion. Since American consumers want to buy 9 billion gallons of ethanol, and American companies only produce 3 billion gallons of ethanol, then we would be importing 9 minus 3, or 6 billion gallons of ethanol. The fact that the amount of imports is the same as our original equilibrium quantity is merely a coincidence. The table at the top of this slide identifies the components of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and economic surplus under our original autarky scenario versus the current free trade scenario. Notice that the area under the demand curve and the original equilibrium price of $2 is represented by the blue triangle labeled with an A. Now with free trade, consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the world price of $1, so the area associated with consumer surplus includes the blue triangle labeled with an A, but now also includes the blue trapezoid B, as well as the blue triangles C and D. I bet you never thought you'd hear the word trapezoid since your high school days, huh? Notice that with a larger area associated with consumer surplus under free trade compared to autarky, we would say that consumer surplus increases due to free trade. In other words, consumers benefit from free trade since prices are lower and consumers like paying as little as possible for the same product. Also, more consumers are able to purchase ethanol since quantity demanded increased, so that's another reason why consumers win in a free trade scenario. Low price and plenty of quantity is a great deal for consumers. But what happens to domestic producers? Under the original scenario in which the U.S. doesn't trade, American companies charged the equilibrium price of $2 and sold 6 billion quantities, so producer surplus is the red triangle E and the blue trapezoid B. Notice that B plus E generates the area for producer surplus in our previous slide. But now that there is free trade, the area above the supply curve and below the market price of $1 has shrunk to just the red triangle E. So American producers are harmed by free trade because they sell their product at a lower price and lower quantity. It's simply not a good result for domestic firms. So American consumers win, but American companies lose under free trade. What's the net effect on the American economy as a whole? Well, we mentioned before that economic surplus under autarky is the area between the demand curve and the supply curve. Now you can see that economic surplus is not only A, B, and E, but now also includes the areas labeled as C and D. Thus, economic surplus is higher under free trade, suggesting that the economy as a whole is better off under free trade compared to autarky. The punchline here is that free trade is good for the economy in the sense that lower prices really help consumers, even though it's to the detriment of American producers. Since free trade is bad for domestic producers, they might lobby the government to restrict free trade. The government might oblige by imposing either a tariff or a quota. You can think of a tariff as a tax on imports, so this would directly impact the price of the product like ethanol. On the other hand, a quota is a limit on the quantity of imports, so this would directly impact the quantity of the product like ethanol. We'll take a look at each of these policies separately and investigate how it affects the free trade graph we just discussed. So again, a tariff is a tax on imports. So let's go back to the example in which the equilibrium price of ethanol is $2 and the market price with free trade is $1. But now let's suppose that the U.S. government imposed a tariff or tax of 50 cents per gallon on ethanol imports. What this tariff would do, as with all taxes, is it's going to raise the market price for the product. Just like how taxes on cigarettes or alcohol raises the prices for these products, a tariff on ethanol, or possibly steel or aluminum, will raise the price for these products. The 50-cent tariff will effectively increase the world price by 50 cents, so the market price for ethanol would be $1.50 instead of $1. Intuitively, we can already predict the impact of this higher price on consumer surplus and producer surplus. Without even looking at a graph, we can anticipate that this higher price will lead to less consumption, and so consumer surplus will be lower once this tariff is imposed. On the other hand, domestic producers are better off because American companies can sell their ethanol at a higher price, which could allow them to earn a higher profit. One big distinction here is that we now need to factor in for the government when thinking about economic surplus, since the government will now be earning revenue from the tariff. We'll need to take a look at the graph in order to think about this more clearly. The new twist to this graph compared to the earlier graph is now we've got the 50-cent increase in the price of ethanol due to the tariff. So at $1.50 per gallon, quantities supplied by American companies will increase from 3 billion gallons to 4.5 billion gallons. Meanwhile, consumers reduce quantity demanded from 9 billion gallons to 7.5 billion gallons. Instead of importing 6 billion gallons, we would now be importing 7.5 billion minus 4.5 billion, which is 3 billion gallons. So this tariff increased our reliance on American ethanol and reduced our dependence on foreign ethanol. Notice that this tariff increased the price of ethanol, which means that this trapezoid A used to be part of consumer surplus, but is now part of producer surplus, which is again the area above the supply curve and the new market price of $1.50. In other words, part of the impact of the tariff is it transferred some consumer surplus to domestic producers, so American companies are happier. But they're not the only ones who benefit from this. The government stands to gain from this policy as well. Before, we assumed no government intervention, so they weren't part of the economy. Now, we need to consider the government as part of economic surplus, so that technically economic surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus plus government surplus. Another word for government surplus is tax revenue. By charging a 50-cent tariff on each of the 3 billion gallons of ethanol being imported, the government would earn $1.5 billion in tax revenue. This is illustrated as the green rectangle T, which used to be part of consumer surplus in the free trade graph. So not only is a portion of consumer surplus transferred to producer surplus, but another portion of consumer surplus gets transferred to government surplus. So what are these yellow triangles labeled as C and D? This used to be part of consumer surplus in our previous graph, but now it's not part of consumer surplus, nor producer surplus, nor government surplus. It just doesn't exist in the economy anymore. Economists refer to this as deadweight loss, since it represents how much economic surplus is lost due to the government policy. In other words, the economy as a whole suffers from a tariff by the amount of the deadweight loss. So at the end of the day, American companies and the government win from a tariff at the expense of American consumers and the overall American economy. Let's wrap up this video and the semester by taking a look at quotas, which has a similar economic impact as tariffs, although the process is different. Instead of the government raising the price by imposing a tax, now the government is limiting the amount of imports. A real-world example of a quota in the US is sugar. By restricting the amount of sugar we can import from the rest of the world to 6.7 billion pounds, the government is controlling the difference between quantity demanded by American consumers and quantity supplied by American companies. We learned that a way to resolve a shortage is by raising price, so a quota will indirectly raise prices. Let's suppose that under free trade, the price of sugar is 18 cents per pound, but now the quota indirectly raised the price of sugar to 28 cents per pound. We can see that the effect of a quota on economic surplus is similar to what we saw in our graph for tariffs. Consumer surplus is lower compared to free trade since consumers hate having to pay a higher price, but this also decreases our quantity demanded due to the law of demand. So there's less consumption and at higher prices, which is definitely not good for consumers. So who wins from a quota? Notice that American sugar producers benefit since they produce 18 billion pounds of sugar instead of 9.6 billion pounds, and they earn 28 cents instead of 18 cents. But they're not the only winners here. Interestingly, foreign sugar producers benefit because they earn a higher price for sugar even though the amount of imports decreases. Notice that the red rectangle B here is associated with foreign sugar producers. In the tariff graph, this was government revenue. But since there is a quota on quantity and not a tariff on price, the government doesn't receive any revenue in this scenario. At the end of the day, there is still deadweight loss, so the economy as a whole is worse off, just like under a tariff. So if you're scoring at home, consumers and the overall economy lose under a quota, whereas American and foreign suppliers of sugar win. One of the justifications for tariffs and quotas is that if American companies produce and sell more domestically, then this will keep jobs within the US. So the question is, how much worse off is the economy, and how does that compare to the number of jobs saved due to tariffs and quotas? In order to answer this important question as objectively as possible, I turn to a report by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, which we learned in the Monetary Policy chapter is one of the 12 districts within the Fed. They empirically calculated the loss to consumer surplus that we illustrated in our graph for tariffs and quotas, as well as determined the number of jobs saved by these policies in a variety of product markets reported in this table. So for example, the US imposes a tariff on benzenoid chemicals, which are used to make detergents and dyes. 216 jobs have remained in the US due to the tariffs, but the impact on consumers is quite large. The annual cost to consumers for each of these 216 jobs is over $1.3 million. I'll leave it up to you to judge whether the benefits outweigh the costs in each of these cases. Now that you're done with the three-part sequence, I encourage you to review the practice problems and their solutions that I provided on Moodle to make sure that you fully understand the concepts introduced in these recordings. As always, feel free to email me with any questions that you have.